We're going to talk about Western water polling and how we can use it. But since I saw some new names and organizations in the chat, I want to start by briefly introducing the Water Hub. We are a program of Climate Nexus. And like Climate Nexus, we provide free communication support for the water movement. We have grant funding to provide hands-on help as well as research like this. I should say that our work is focused in the Western US, but we also work across the country. And we've been doing more of that lately with all of the focus on federal infrastructure dollars. And so the polling that we're going to cover today is a mix of state, regional, and nationwide polling. Here's the full Water Hub team. As I said, we are a program of Climate Nexus. And so Molly is joining us from Climate Nexus, and we have the benefit of having some real expertise on staff there in both public opinion research as well as media and lots of climate topics. And as you'll hear today, we're going to get into the nexus of water and climate, which of course is really central to our work. I want to mention that there's also tons more polling about climate change in the Climate Nexus Polling Center, which we'll drop a link to in the chat. And then there's also more richness about current opinion on climate that I'm not going to get into today in Walton Family Foundation's poll that was released this week for World Water Day and some of the other surveys as well, which we'll also share after the presentation. So our plan for the hour is to talk about first, how do we use polling and what is the relationship between polling and media? Then we're going to look at top lines from the latest research, including what voters are most worried about and what they support. And what does that indicate for how we operate as a communicator? And lastly, as I said, we will reserve time for question and answer. And one more thing that I want to mention is that we are just starting to develop the questionnaire for our next national water poll. So if the topics that we cover today spark question ideas for you, we'd love for you to drop those into the chat as well, or the Q&A, because we won't be able to cover everything that's in the current research, but we're also always on the lookout for what else would bear further research. So starting with, how do we use polling? I have been working with polling for a number of years as a media strategist, but I heard a colleague at Climate Nexus, Hunter Cutting, describe the way we might use it this way, and I really loved it. He said, polling can either be a roadmap or a weather report. And what I took away from that is we can either treat the polling as directive, right, and speak to what voters are currently worried about, or we can treat it as an indicator of where people are now and of what the opportunities and needs are for additional education or for dot connecting between existing concerns and things that impact those concerns but may not be top of mind for voters. And so throughout this presentation, I'm going to pause to say what I think the lesson might be for communicators. I want to mention that media is one of the inputs, one of the ingredients in the stew that makes up public opinion. It is something that people take in alongside input from friends and family, from faith leaders, from their own personal experiences, and that media is changing, right? It used to be all about the newspaper, and now a lot of people don't even subscribe to or read a paper newspaper. They may get most of their news from social media, and that's filtered a lot by our own interests and our own network. And so one of the things that we always have in mind when we're looking at polling is where do we need to focus our communications and education and awareness building efforts in order to reach people that may be persuadable but don't yet have these issues on their radar. The good news is, that public opinion is changeable. So getting back to that weather report analogy, it definitely doesn't stay the same over time. But there are certain things that are pretty stable. This list of primary values is from Nancy Belden and John Rusinello, a couple of pollsters that have done work on social and environmental issues for, I don't know, 30 plus years. And they distilled this list of what they call primary values. That is the things that tend to influence people's decision-making and be fairly, like really close to the heart and not very changeable. And it's a lot of things you might expect, like care for your family, spirituality, a sense of fairness, and freedom. The interesting thing, though, is that the way that people interpret these values really varies. And so I think one of the jobs that we have as communicators is framing our work in terms that will resonate with people based on what's closest to their heart. But within that set of primary values, there's lots of room for movement. And I really love this animated graphic that Sarah actually flagged for me from Yale Climate Communications 6 Americas work, where they're sort of tracing people's views on climate change. And as you can see, over the course of 15 years, concern has really risen. And of course, that partly has to do with people's personal experiences of extreme weather. It also certainly has to do with the increased amount of media coverage that connects events that people experience to climate science and to climate change. And so I think that's really like an opportunity and a lesson for us that in the water world, there has been a substantial amount of movement over the past decade or so, and I think there's room for more. Similar to concern about climate change, concern about water has been rising steeply. This is from Colorado College's State of the Rockies poll, which is a handy one to refer to because they tend to ask the same questions year over year. And as you can see here, over the course of 7 to 10 years, people's concern about both water supply as well as water pollution has been rising. And we'll dig much deeper into that particular poll in a moment. The reason that concern is rising is, partly because of what people are reading. This is just a snapshot of headlines from the past, couple of weeks. And, they're pretty hyperbolic as news reports can be sometimes. So, talking about running out of drinking water, this new term that we're seeing bandied about, mega drought, the idea of our survival being at stake. That has definitely hit home for people. So the good news is that I think people are primed for action. And in fact, they want action on water. And now the work of water advocates is to frame our solutions in terms that feel like they respond to both the urgency and the scale of the crisis. And that can be hard at times when you're talking about, I know a lot of the partners on this call work on, distributed or decentralized infrastructure, things like conservation or on-site recycling. The sort of 19th century way of addressing water was these mega projects that felt like legacy solutions that were concrete monuments to human ingenuity. And that felt appropriate to the scale of the problem. And so there is some education that we have to do to frame these more diffuse solutions as adding up to enough to address the problems that we're facing collectively. The good news is that when an issue is surfaced for the public and it remains on their radar for year over year, then we tend to see policy progress. And so here I'm sharing, President Biden's tweets about lead pipes. I'm sure everyone on this call tracked how central lead pipe replacement was to President Biden's infrastructure case. Regardless of the fact that the amount of funding that was eventually allocated in the infrastructure package wasn't sufficient to actually replace all of the nation's pipes, he really clearly read, his team read the polling and saw that this was an issue that was really concrete, that was well understood, that people could connect to values like health, like family, like fairness. And so I think it's a great instructive moment in how if we can layer in those values and be responsive to something that is in the public eye, then we can actually make progress. And when an issue is not yet in the public eye, there's still potential for progress. Communications can help bridge that gap. So some of the issues that we're working on right now that in some cases with you or inspired by your work are things like groundwater. We all just celebrated both Groundwater Awareness Week and then World Water Day. And we know that groundwater is out of sight, out of mind for a lot of people. And so I think, the work that so many groups on this call are doing to help people understand how groundwater connects to rivers and springs that we all love, how groundwater helps feed us, how groundwater is drinking water. That dot connecting can be really powerful. Similarly, groups on this call have been doing a ton of work to talk about water debt and how we can make water affordable and accessible for everyone. In the water and climate intersection, I think there's great awareness that climate change is water change, but perhaps less understanding that water solutions are climate solutions. I'm going to share some polling in a moment that shows how broad the support is for green infrastructure, for instance, and water conservation. And I think how much of an opportunity there is to use water as the frame for climate solutions because of how much less politicized and polarized it is than climate change. And similarly with green infrastructure, I think that, people intuitively love the idea of nature-based solutions. They intuitively really like the idea of living in a place that's green and cool and walkable. And so I think there's lots of data out there that shows how we can frame a kind of wonky concept, wonky concept like green infrastructure in terms that will resonate with people. Just one more sort of big picture reflection from the polling world is that while people do definitely still take cues in part from media, one thing we know from Walton's recent poll, from Climate Nexus's polling, is that TV is the primary news source that people turn to for both climate and water information. And that's a challenge because TV stories are really short. And a lot of them lack context. And so they may cover, for instance, a storm or a scientific study, but not include a ton about the impacts or the potential for future prevention. And so I think it's incumbent on us as communicators to both try to add nuance to TV stories by educating TV journalists, which we're lucky at Climate Nexus that we have a whole broadcast team that's been working with us really closely on drought stories, for instance, but also to round out people's media diet with really smart digital content, with great print news stories, with radio stories, et cetera. I'd love to pause there for questions if any have come up before we dig into the specifics of the polling that we have. Waiting just long enough for it to get awkward.
I can add one thing. Oh, I'm so sorry.
Please do. And then I see Craig has a hand as well.
Yeah, I was just going to add that our polling also shows, speaking to Nicole's last point, that people want to, they want folks in the media talking about these issues. It was at some point taboo or perceived as taboo to talk about climate change in the wake of extreme weather disasters. And we know from our polling and lots of other polling that across the country, people want they want weathercasters and news reporters on TV to be connecting climate change to those events and climate change to what's happening in the world around them, to droughts, to things like that. So that's kind of another point in support of pushing for the importance of making those kinds of connections among journalists.
Great, and I think Craig's question actually may be best addressed by you, Molly. He asked, any sense in the relative difference between TV and online sources, and for TV, local versus national?
Yeah, so in general, right, we know that people, especially on water, they get a lot of their news from TV, and people tend to trust local people more than national people. That's true at the government level, and that's also generally true in the media. There's kind of a general distrust of the media as a big institution, which is not really how the media operates anymore. But people kind of still think of the media as this big thing, and they lump in kind of these big legacy institutions with that. And a lot of people are getting their news from, blogs or online sources or social media, especially. I think that's really an area, where there's people are getting a lot of their information from social media and maybe aren't as skeptical of it as they might be from a big national newspaper or big national online source.
We do have one more question in the chat, which I think would be good to get into before the specifics. Tony asks, what is the value in news calling out climate deniers?
That's a great question. I have a couple of thoughts, and then I would love if Sarah or Nicole have thoughts. I think there are a couple of things. I think that a lot of what is climate denial is not framed in the media as climate denial. So this is not necessarily water specific, but other folks at Nexus have done a lot of work around and are doing a lot of work around natural gas. And for years and years, natural gas was framed as a bridge solution. It's better than coal. It's clean. It's your stove. It's great. And we know, and we've known for a long time, that natural gas is not a solution. And especially with what's going on in the world right now, and the recent announcement about this US-EU task force on LNG, and kind of this push to build out this fossil fuel infrastructure that we're going to be stuck with for years and years. People kind of take that as, natural gas it's better than coal, so it's good. And that's not quite the same climate denial as someone outright calling climate change a hoax. But it's not really climate truth either. And so I think there's, a lot of kind of education gap in a lot of places. And I think that's one value, is just getting people to think more critically about, what to kind of challenge the assumptions that they have had for a really long time, and maybe, start to sow those seeds of, maybe I should be thinking more critically about questioning that the things that I know about the climate or my surroundings or the water access that I have.
And thanks, Molly. I would just add that I think our strategy typically when we're managing opposition is less about calling them out, which I think can sometimes draw more attention to them and create more space for their assertions. And it's more about inoculating against their messaging by asserting what we know to be true and connecting it to what we know people care about. And then also sort of reinforcing the case for the thing that we're saying. So, we'll get into some polling specifically about farmers and agriculture in this next section. And, like the sort of lack of understanding, I think it's similar to, the lack of understanding on some climate issues and how we recommend navigating the sort of education gap so that we're not directly countering people's deeply held beliefs, because I think that is not a winning strategy.
We have some great convo going on in the chat. I know Meredith was trying to share a anecdote she learned yesterday from an AP reporter, and just wanted to flag, we have a great question from Allie, but I think we should wait for the next break for that.
Excellent. Well, then I'll dig into the polling, and hopefully that will spark more questions as well as answering some. Sorry, just realized I was muted. So here is the research that we reviewed. There are four state-specific polls from the past 4 or 5 months in Colorado, Arizona, California, and New Mexico, and then 3 regional and national polls. And we will follow up with those we're able to share. They're not all public, but we'll follow up with the ones that we're able to share after this webinar. And the top lines, voters are really worried, not just about water supply, which we're going to spend a lot of time on in this discussion, but also about water safety. Clean drinking water specifically polls as one of the most highly supported and most bipartisan issues in the environment. And I would say probably among social issues as well. It's just really, really popular. And drinking water specifically. US Water Alliance, by the way, has done incredible polling. They have an annual poll called Value of Water, where they ask a lot of questions about trust in drinking water, about willingness and support for investments in drinking water. We can include that as well. When asked about, pollution of rivers, lakes, and streams, the number is lower than people who are, concerned about safe drinking water or supportive of safe drinking water, but it's on the rise. And one interesting thing, this is from a national poll that we did last March. We asked people where they think drinking water safety is at risk. And pollution of source waters was the top concern that came up. 69% of people raised that as a very high, medium threat. But what we were heartened to see is that increasingly voters recognize that outdated public plumbing is also a threat to safe drinking water. And I think this is a result of all of the education and advocacy that was happening over the past year plus, building towards the infrastructure push about the fact that our public plumbing is really old and in some cases unsafe and certainly not climate ready. And so this, I think, indicates even more opportunity for us to continue pushing for increased investment and also for prioritizing investment in the places with the most need, which I'll get into in a moment, as well as the solutions that multi-solve different challenges. So this is from Colorado College's annual State of the Rockies poll, the most recent version of which just came out last month. And you can see these numbers for supporting federal funding for rural and tribal water and sanitation are through the roof. Like, over 90% of people support and over 50% strongly support investing in rural and tribal water and sanitation. And so the good news is that we have, a sort of historic amount of money in the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, in particular for tribal water and sanitation. But I know there are lots of pushes underway, both to make sure those funds get to the ground quickly and to sort of counter the, some of the historic practices that have made it hard for communities in need to access those funds. And I'll say that implementation work is harder to understand. And so the more that we can orient our implementation work around the benefit versus the process, the more successful we'll be. When asked about funding for water, the good news is that people also see it as good for public health, for the environment, and a job creator. And in our national poll last March, we also asked whether people were concerned about water rates rising as a result. And there wasn't a ton of concern. In fact, I've seen the question about, are you willing to pay more for safer water or for increased water access tested in California, tested nationwide. And in general, there is a strong willingness to pay for more for safe water or for increased water justice. As I said, water supply worries are rising even more steeply than water safety concerns. And that's especially true in the West, where 73% of voters in Walton's March poll said that they're worried about climate-driven water scarcity. And this was a really striking statistic to me. Over a quarter said their state will probably or definitely not have enough water in 100 years. And over 50% of voters in Arizona and Colorado said that. But we got a little bit more data from some of the open-ended questions. that Walton asked, both in their most recent poll as well as the state-specific polls they did in the fall. And one of the things that the pollsters noted is that this idea of water scarcity, while it's definitely on people's radars, it remains pretty abstract. It's not an everyday concern. And I think this is, a function of people not being super connected to their water sources. We know from past polling that I think less than half of people can name the source of their drinking water. Many people don't know whether it's a river or groundwater. And so they may not even know when they're reading, for instance, news of the Colorado River or of the Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta's struggles, how that impacts them. And so I think as communicators, the opportunity is to, do even more, which I know so many groups on this call are doing, education about the flow of water, its sources and its beneficiaries, but also to elevate all of the current and future impacts of drought and of water shortages. And I think, the mainstream media, and in particular the TV media story about drought in the West, Sarah has done quite a lot of media analysis on that, and I've done some in California. It tends to be very character driven, and a lot of the visuals and the headlines that have stuck with people is about, almond orchards being torn out or fallowed. And there's less about drinking water. There's a fair amount about development concerns and how are we going to support growth. But this real rubber meets the road thing about, are people going to have their taps running dry, I think is particularly visceral. And is a current threat in California. There have been 1,000 dry wells just in the past year, and I know that there have been dry wells elsewhere in the West. The good news, though, is that people want action. And in particular, when asked who they want to act, I think there is an interest in both state, federal, and local leaders taking action. Nationally, 85% of voters agree that we ought to protect rivers, lakes, and streams, and 90% said we should practice water conservation. That's a really, really high number. And you might think that people would have conservation fatigue, because here in the West, I'm in my 40s and I've been hearing about turning off the water when I brush my teeth for almost my entire life. But in fact, people continue to be willing and believe that we should and can do more. I'll say one note about this from Walton's poll that I found really powerful was that they asked, how important is it to practice water conservation? 90% of voters said it's important, and 62% said it's very important. They asked the question a little bit differently, though, and said, how important is it to ensure sustainable use? Only 48% of voters said it's very important. And so when we're writing policies, when we're developing our communications campaigns, I think it's important to use language that's accessible. Water conservation immediately evokes images for a lot of people, right? I talked about turning off the taps when you brush your teeth. People also know about, replacing thirsty lawns with native plants. They know about upgrading your appliances, fixing leaks. Ensuring sustainable use, I think, is a little bit more abstract of a term. And so one other piece about conservation that I noted in the qualitative information from the polls is that people tend to think of individual conservation as like, that's what conservation is households doing more with less. And that's partly a function of the campaigns that we have underway, right? California Save Our Water, Colorado's current campaign. And that's great if those campaigns build people's water literacy generally, build awareness about where water comes from, about this being a shared challenge and a collective effort. But I think that there's an opportunity to expand people's sense of where the conservation opportunities are, so that they can support the range of policies needed. Which gets me to this point. I said I was going to talk about agriculture, and we know from this latest wave of research, as well as a lot of past polls, that people don't understand where our water goes generally. In California, almost half of voters recognize that ag is the biggest water user, but in New Mexico, where that's also true, just a quarter understood that. And when Walton asked voters across the country whether they thought it was appropriate that 70% of our water goes to farming, half said it's about right. Similarly, in California, when we asked voters who should be protected from drought impacts, agricultural water users ranked at the top of the list, above farm workers, above households and low-income communities, which I found really striking. And I think is reflective of the fact that, there's been a really effective effort on the part of the agricultural industry to communicate how they feed the world and how there's no better use of our water than growing food for people. And in California, where I'm from, I literally was just there earlier this week. There are billboards along the highway and posters and editorials and op-eds in every Central Valley newspaper in farm country. And that messaging has really hit home. And so I think it's not a winning strategy to fly in the face of it. We need to speak to that value and add nuance. This is the sort of media that I was talking about. This is not a TV story. This was a Fresno Bee newspaper story, but there's a lot of pathos in the plight of farmers right now. These are people who have been, working the land in many cases for generations and are questioning whether or not there's a future for their children doing the same. And that's real, and we don't at all want to diminish that. But what we want to do is elevate some of the other people who are impacted by drought and communicate the need to balance all of these different uses. And the reason I say that is that people trust farmers. In Colorado and Arizona, people think that individuals and corporations are bigger water wasters. And nationwide, voters trust farmers and ranchers to use water responsibly. So what that means to us is that, framing the farmers as the problem isn't the way forward. I think the couple of strategies that we have had in mind, and we're super interested to be in conversation with all of you that are doing work on agricultural water efficiency, on regenerative farming, agroecology, et cetera, is talking about, some of the problems with the current food system. People definitely get the idea that industrialization and that corporatization, the Wall Streetification, aren't consistent with the food system that they want to have. And also that it's totally possible to feed the community differently. This is one example of a solution story that ran in the Chronicle a month or so ago about a farmer growing wheat in wine country and the incredible business that she's built. And I know there's great stories in Arizona about transitioning land from alfalfa to grains for breweries, and what a benefit that's been for so many different sectors. I think those sorts of win-win stories are really powerful. And it's one of the things that the Water Hub is really excited to do more of with you. Next week, in fact, we are hosting a media briefing about climate change in the Central Valley. And one of our speakers is going to be Dennis Hudson from this farm in Allensworth, California, who is, it's not only an organic farm, it's a teaching farm that grows a whole range of crops. And here you can see them planting hedgerows alongside their cropland as a windbreak, as pollinator habitat. They are doing all sorts of water efficiency and soil health practices. And so I think lifting up those stories of what's possible, this is in Tulare County, California, which is one of the driest parts of the state, where a lot of what of the agriculture that is happening is really, really big corporate ag. And so lifting up the story of basic, of small independent farmers who are in relationship with the community and still producing food, I think can be really powerful. Another solution that people love intuitively is this idea of natural solutions. In Walton's March poll, 3/4 of people believed that climate solutions are most effective when they work for both people and nature. And a similar amount said that they liked the idea of natural infrastructure to address climate change. That's already high, but when the pollsters asked about more specific solutions like giving rivers room to roam, restoring wetlands, or shoring up coastal and river communities to reduce flood risk, the support went up. And so I think that is a reminder to us rather than using these umbrella terms that are a sort of shorthand for advocates and policymakers, to get really descriptive and specific and paint a picture in people's mind of not only what the intervention is that you're proposing, what the kind of project is, but also how it helps. So when we say just shoring up coastal and river communities, it may not be super meaningful to people, but when we say to reduce flood risk, yes, I can see the immediate benefit of that, and I can get on board with that. Similarly, while groundwater, is invisible for the most part, there's really strong support for protecting it in theory. Again, from the Walton poll, 83% of voters nationwide agree that we should protect it. In New Mexico, a majority liked the idea of more monitoring and regulation. And I would say that's really encouraging, because the word regulation can tend to be quite polarizing for people. In California, about the same amount, 59%, like the idea of protecting or replenishing groundwater reserves. And again, I think this relatively, it's still a majority, a solid majority, but I think in California, part of the reason that number is not higher is because of the amount that the state Sustainable Groundwater Management Act has been politicized in the Central Valley in particular. Just one more word on solutions that is really heartening is that people intuitively think that it's better to make better use of what we have than to pursue new water. Colorado College every year asks, do you prefer the idea of using our current supplies more wisely or increasing diversions? And every year, a very, very strong majority say we ought to make wiser use of what we have. And so that's the frame that we've been trying to use for a lot of our water supply campaigns, is like, we can stretch what we have, we can make wiser use of what we have. Because I think the era of new water is largely over. And the opportunities for developing new water supplies are often so expensive or so environmentally harmful that they just don't pencil out. That said, we know that those calls for supply projects, from pipelines to dams to reservoirs and dam raises, remains. And so we asked in California. We asked a similar question in California and found that people like the idea of conservation. But when we asked them, what do you think the challenges are with California's water system? The top ranking challenge was it needs more dams and reservoirs to store water. I literally just heard from my father-in-law this week in the Bay Area about a Central Valley reservoir that's being built. He said, well, I guess we got to do more to catch the rain, right? Because we're not going to get the snow melt. And so I think people intuitively like the idea. They understand that, that weather patterns are changing and that we have to change the way we manage water. And so when we are, for instance, advocating for groundwater recharge versus a reservoir, which is harder to see and is one of those decentralized solutions, it's important that we connect those dots and that we're really clear about the advantages in terms of cost, as well as, fishery health and the like. Similarly, in California, we just fought, and I think at least for the moment, have defeated an industry that is ag industry and desalination industry funded ballot measure that was called More Water Now. That was it would have set aside a certain percentage of the general fund for supply projects. And specifically, I think was designed to streamline environmental review processes so that they could get approved and permitted more quickly. And a lot of the proponents were desalination proponents. And that framing of More Water Now was really smart, right? And it's much simpler and easier to wrap your brain around than our calls for, the sort of silver buckshot range of solutions, from conservation to rainwater harvest and the like. And so we've been working and would love to work with more of you on how to assert a vision for water, for there being enough water that that can be distilled down pretty simply. And I'll share one thing that we have in progress, but it's certainly not perfect. And we'd love to work with you on more things. This is an infographic that Pacific Institute and NRDC released a couple of years ago that we're actually currently working with Pacific Institute, a water think tank in the Bay Area, to update. that's about the untapped savings in California. And it's contrasting the amount of water that's available to California through conservation, reuse, and rainwater to the amount that we use. And it's more than twice as much. So when people say we can't meet water needs just through conservation, it's just a drop in the bucket, these sorts of communications tools can help to correct the record or to preempt that idea that no, in fact, we need to desalinate every drop of seawater or we need to build more dams, because in fact, there is ample untapped potential here. That's it. Just in summary, and then I'll open it up to more conversation. Voters are really worried and they want action. And when we look at, specific messages or specific motives, public health is really, I think, the top concern, followed by, food and farming. People care a lot about. People also care about healthy rivers, lakes, and streams. Now, pause my share and turn it over to Sarah for Q questions and answers.
Yeah, and I see Horst's hand up, and I'm going to go back to the ones that we held first, and then we'll make our way through. And yes, feel free if you have more questions that have come up for you to put them in the chat or Q&A. So here is a question from Allie. I noticed you used the term water pollution as opposed to water quality. What other shifts in terminology and style culture are you seeing, and how important is it to change our past and current messaging? For context, we have a lot of educational resources on our site, and it's sometimes difficult to wrangle to keep everything up to date.
Yeah, thanks, Allie. Absolutely. I mean, we often talk about water safety, actually, as the sort of, the shorthand for drinking water. And when we're talking about source water quality, we might talk about water pollution, or we might talk about, I don't know if it's the coast keepers, the water keepers who came up with fishable, swimmable, drinkable. But I think that those kinds of language changes make a ton of sense, because I never used the term water quality until I started working in water. And if I said it to my, to my family that don't follow this stuff closely, they wouldn't know. And so I think, yeah, as I said, water conservation versus sustainable use, naming the specific project and describing it versus umbrella terms like green infrastructure or nature-based solutions. This is actually something that we've been playing with, the idea of doing a whole use this, not that type roundtable discussion. And I think that we can work on that. But I also welcome other people to drop into the chat things that swaps they've made and have found resonate.
Mouse muted. So this is a big one from Ted. Besides dealing with climate deniers, how do we change the public opinion of an entire political party? Because we are not going to be able to make the progress we need without both parties recognizing that climate change is an issue we need to address.
Yeah, I can start with this one. The short answer is we won't. There is a chunk of folks who they've just dug their heels in and they're never going to change their minds. The chart of those 6 Americas, right? We know that the percentage of folks in the United States who are alarmed about climate change has grown over the last decade. It's like nearly doubled and is now at 33% of the country who is alarmed about climate change. But the chunk at the bottom who is dismissive, those are folks that we are not going to get. But that's a really small percentage. I don't remember the number off the top of my head, but it's very, very low. And so those are the people that we're never going to reach, but that's a small percentage of the population. The good news is that there are a few points of good news. Number one, which Nicole mentioned several times, is that water solutions are supported across party lines. We find this in other kinds of solutions. It's the things that people see and think about every day, right? Water has, though it may be certain policies may be contentious at different levels, it's it's not people aren't like, yeah, I want bad water. That's just not a position that people have. And especially people can really relate water to health. And we know that health is a frame that is popular across party. And the other piece of good news is that the Republican Party is changing. Younger Republicans between the ages of 18 and 34 or so look very different on most issues than Republicans over the age of 65. There are obviously exceptions there, but especially on climate change, younger Republicans are much more likely to say that it's human caused. They're much more likely to support certain climate solutions than older Republicans. So I think it's kind of all of those things together, right? There's still a more narrow audience that you're going to be able to change their minds. But they're already starting to move in that direction. It's really about figuring out who those people are, whether it's from a media analysis or more polling to kind of dig in on who those people are, whether it's looking at community leaders that maybe aren't operating in a particularly partisan way. So that's the longer answer to your question.
Thanks, Molly. Yeah, and I think you did a great job answering. I'll just add, I'll drop in the chat too. We actually wrote a report last summer called The Opportunity on Water that was specifically about how to use the bipartisan support for water solutions, the bipartisan concern for water to advance all sorts of environmental initiatives and policies. And I think that we lifted up some specific examples in there, but it's happening in many cases in the West. Like we're seeing legislation with Republican authors that have a lot of benefits.
One thing I'll add, which I think kind of leads into our next question as well, is we're talking a lot about the message right now, but the messenger is often even more important. And so knowing who you're trying to talk to, and we often talk about knowing your audience, like if you're trying to talk to everybody, you're talking to nobody. So knowing who you're really trying to reach, and also the messengers that are going to be persuasive to them, because if you're coming at it with your best message tested communication, but it's coming from somebody that audience isn't going to listen to, then it's not really going to matter. And so Caitlin asks, what are the different roles that private, public, and NGO charitable foundations can play in increasing investments needed to make water more secure?
I mean, we have some funders on the call. I'm not sure where Nina is calling in from, but I'll just say that, Ted Kowalski, who just asked a question, is from Walton Family Foundation. I know they're doing a lot to try to support a range of water access issues. Similarly, in Water Foundation just launched a drought campaign that's about building private support to leverage federal and state dollars, specifically with the goal of building grassroots and frontline capacity to advocate for funding, to advocate for effective and equitable implementation of funding. And so I think that is often like one of the gaps that we see, and that the Water Hub's work is trying to support, is that, we know with FEMA funding and we know with state revolving fund spending of water infrastructure dollars, that money often flows to power. And so that communities that already have resources, that have capacity to write grants, that have shovel-ready projects, tend to get in line first and receive the lion's share of the resources. And so I think one powerful role that philanthropy is playing right now is trying to level that playing field and trying to redress this historic capacity gap in which the communities that don't have a lot of capacity remain underfunded and disinvested.
Great. I'm going to take Horst off mute, and then we have a great question on efficiency from Jared, and I think that'll probably take us to the hour, but if you have more questions about the polling, please feel free to drop them, because I know we can follow up after the webinar as well. Horst, you're off mute if you want to ask your question.
Oh, there. Sorry. Yes, earlier in the survey stuff, I've see a lot of the research from Pew and terms of the which party you are and your response, and it tends to be the resources tend to be more negatively viewed by conservatives than by liberals. And so I'm wondering, when you're doing research, are you able to catch these types of different views of other people?
Yeah, Horst, we have crosstabs that for the national poll that WaterHub ran, and I'm not sure if they're available from Walton or from State of the Rockies, but I can check, that do break down by political party as well as by race and ethnicity, and in some cases by other demographic identities like age. So we can send you what we're able to share and then flag other available resources.
Thank you.
I was muted. And then last, we have a question from Jared. Water can be saved by increasing water efficiency in agriculture. However, we can't expect agricultural producers to bear the cost burden of modernizing and increasing efficiency on their own. So we need legislation and programs that assist agricultural water efficiency. Has anyone polled the public about the creation of programs or subsidies that support funding for agricultural producers to increase efficiency?
Yes, Jared. We asked that in our national poll, as well as a Western regional poll that the WaterHub did with Climate Nexus. And I can dig those up and flag those questions specifically. I think Walton may have also asked that in their state specific poll, so I'll look at that. Generally, the support is there. It's still a majority. It tends to be a little lower whenever you get deeper into the policy specifics and the how, support tends to drop from the what. And that's just inherent in polling, in my experience. But I would say there's still strong majority support for instance, funding agricultural efficiency, for voluntary programs, for incentives, for technical support. And we're happy to, if there's specific legislation that you are pushing now, where it'd be helpful to have more current figures, we'd love to know so we can include that in our next poll.
Yeah, and I'll just add that even as the policy gets more narrow, efficiency is something that's a word that people know, even if they don't know what a large scale agricultural efficiency project might mean. This speaks to, right, the turning off the faucet while you're brushing your teeth, right? People can grasp onto something, and those are the policies, or those are the ideas or the policies that tend to get more support because people can grasp onto them.
I do just want to flag a great comment in the chat on what is meant by agricultural efficiency. Jamie, I believe from the New Mexico Acequia Association, is just saying that Western science is catching up with traditional indigenous knowledge regarding the benefits of flood irrigation for the total water budget in a watershed. So yeah, if you have a link to that research, we'd be happy to share that out as well.
Yeah, and on that point, Jamie, I want to mention that, there's a lot of discussion about whether these, ag accounts for 70 or 80% of use in a state or in a region, for instance, is an accurate way to characterize it, because agricultural water is in many cases used many times, much more sort of efficiently than, flood irrigation may, for instance, replenish the aquifer or feed nearby streams. So I think that that there's a lot of nuance there. We haven't tested that, but I think that we definitely appreciate your comment that Western science is starting to catch up to and recognize the value of its traditional ecological knowledge. Yeah, and I see Jamie also noted that the state and environmentalists don't tend to differentiate between big ag and traditional or small family farm. I think that's true, and I think that that's a missed opportunity. I know that NRDC has a whole report and series coming out on regenerative agriculture, and there is quite a lot of work happening in various corners. to lift up the, the sort of benefit and the sustainability and the climate benefits of farming. And I think part of the reason that you may see environmentalists not making that distinction is because the agricultural sector functions as a block in terms of its policy platform very often. And that isn't necessarily because there's, it's a monolith ideologically, but it's because of where the money and the resources and the lobbying cloud are with the sort of big industrial players.
And we're at time, but someone just asked about these resources being shared. So yes, everyone who is attending and registered will get a follow-up email with the recording and all the links.